I'm Kelly, and I'm here with Karyn today, and we're going to continue answering some questions that we received from some people who are grieving and just to help normalize some of the normal grief feelings. And so I'm going to ask Karyn a question. And so, what do you think? Is it normal to feel bitter and angry after the loss of a parent?
Yeah, well, I think we both probably hear this a lot, getting this question in some form or another. And it's a hard one because, there's already so many changes that people are experiencing in themselves following a loss. And I think walking around with some of those angry feelings, we could say bitter, resentful, it's a really kind of hard place to be. I describe some of those as like the ugly emotions, the things that we hate to think, admit out loud, say to other people, but they're really normal and very common. We think of grief, I've probably said this before, in terms of sadness, and that's the only part that we would necessarily expect, but anger is just as much a part of it, I think, as is a couple of other, difficult, challenging feelings. So, is it normal? I would say yes. And I think there oftentimes the reason why is because we do feel like we've been cheated in some way. We feel perhaps shortchanged. We can look around and see examples everywhere of people whose lives have been maybe unaffected or seemingly unaffected. We don't know, a stranger's life as they go by. But in this example, if we're talking about a parent, all I have to do is be out going out to lunch and I see a mother and daughter or a father and son or something. And I feel like, why me? And it's not a case of like wishing bad things to happen to other people, but it just really seems, I think, very unfair. And I talk to people about that a lot. Like, grief is very complex and very layered, and we can get out a thesaurus and list so many different emotions to describe it. And yet, at the base of it and the core of it is rather simple, which for a lot of people is I'm sad and this just feels really unfair. And I think that's where some of the anger comes from. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that the anger can be sort of directed. I think we can feel angry. I've kind of used the example of being bitter or angry at people, but I think we can also feel angry at a healthcare system if we feel like something was failed or missed along the way. We can be angry at immediate family if we feel like they didn't help out or step in when they should, or in the aftermath, things with the estate, perhaps. Um, and oddly, and this one's hard for people, but I think we can also feel angry at the person who's gone. People can sometimes feel like they've been abandoned. Why did you leave me with this? Why did this have to happen? And that can be in lots of cases, regardless of how a person passed. But I think probably most especially if there's even an inkling that someone could have done something to prevent their passing, like go to the doctor or change certain habits, then that anger can come up. So it's like lots of options for anger and bitterness. And again, for some people going to be a very unusual feeling. So what are some of the things that have come up with you when you're talking to people about that?
Well, what it brought up for me was thinking of myself as a teenager after my mom died. And I remember being at school and my classmates would be like complaining about their mom.
Mm,
And I was very bitter and angry. And I'd like, well, at least she's not dead.
yeah.
I was so, hearing people talk about that was really hard for me and still sometimes is, or even when people talk about, this great relationship they have with their mother, not feeling a little bitter that I've never experienced a relationship with my mom as an adult. I
Yeah.
don't know what that's like. But I agree with everything you said is, it's so normal. Anger is such a big part of grief for so many people, not all, but a lot of people. And it is very common to be angry at the person who died as well. I think that comes up a lot and people feel really guilty for that. But they're angry that they left them, even though that's not really they had a choice. But it's just that loneliness and not having them to be in their life anymore.
Yeah.
And then angry for sometimes the way people treat them,
Hmm.
after the death and feeling like, well, people just aren't sensitive and they're not grief informed. And so they say things that aren't helpful. Sometimes they say really hurtful things. I've heard some stories this week that's heartbreaking. There's been a lot of bullying in the little kids that I work with
Mm,
by their peers. And some of the things that their peers are saying to them, well, you know, your parent was ugly or whatever, or just awful things about how they died. And so how can you not be angry when those kind of things happen? And this is happening to like elementary school kids.
Yeah.
So, I think we even have to think about these feelings happen in kids as well. It's not just adult clients that we see.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you have to imagine, like, if it's a case of maybe, let's say, a child who's lost a parent, and that surviving parent is already trying so hard to get this kid, through this, and then going to school, that's what they're facing. And the anger that that would probably give the parent, in turn through all of it. It's just, far reaching, that's for sure. And, there is some saying about like just not knowing what people around you are going through, and the reason why we need to sort of be kind to everybody because everybody's going through something. And that's certainly true. It's interesting, because I talk to people not only about some of the causes of anger but how it's manifesting for them. Like, where are you seeing it come out? Is it at work? Is it in your relationships? Usually it's probably in all of those places. And what I say is like, listen, like, if you recognize it as part of your grieving process, and just as you won't be, uncontrollably sobbing forever, at least consistently as you do in the very beginning, you can probably expect some of the anger to soften and wane too. So it's okay to be angry. We just don't want to feel that this, plants and seeds itself to make us an angry person, starting to really mistrust the world and think that it's not a good or safe place for us. And that's where I think we have to be mindful and do the work. So it's like, I want to normalize it for people,
Absolutely.
but also say, like, let's also just make sure we're never going to that place that I'm starting to just feel angry without direction all the time. And I think that sometimes, I've had people, I think, come for grief support because of that reason, because they're like, there's something I haven't dealt with here.
Well, and I think a lot of times that anger does maybe come out sideways. I talk about all the time, like we put stuff behind a wall, behind a wall, behind a wall. And sometimes it just starts oozing out because we're not leaning into it. We're not sitting with our grief. If we haven't done our grief work and we're trying
Yeah.
to avoid it, I think that's really when you can maybe see that anger come out sideways and, in ways that you're like, wait a minute, this isn't me. What's happened? Like, I
Yes.
don't like feeling this way. And I think a lot of times it is because we don't want to feel these big grief feelings. They're hard. And we want to be able to push it under, a rug and just pretend it's not there. But it does come out sideways. And sometimes it comes out in ways that aren't always helpful or healthy for us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's, and again, it's the part of all of this that you don't necessarily expect. And I think it's scary to think that it's becoming a more permanent personality
Mhm.
change. So that's what I do try to encourage people to, is to, of course, be mindful of it, but also, understand that hopefully and more than likely it's going to be something that progresses and changes in a little bit of a different way for them,
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
sure. Yeah.
And I think it's about figuring out how do you let out this anger in a healthy way, right? What
Hmm.
are some healthy things you can do? Maybe it's journaling, maybe it's using movement, maybe it's, talking more about it, so figuring out what's going to help you to be able to release that anger in healthy ways.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I love the use of the word symptoms when we talk about these things, because it's like, when you have the flu, like, you may not be able to get rid of it or take medicine for it, but you can manage your symptoms. So we try and manage our symptoms of grief as we are trying to, work through it. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
All right. Well, great answer. Thanks so much, Karen.
Yeah.
So
Thanks,
stay
Kelly.
tuned. So stay tuned for more questions from Kelly and Karen.